Today on The Unbelievable Show we will examine the bizarre death of Belgian financial tycoon, Alfred Loewenstein. Alfred Loewenstein was born in 1877 in Brussels. Not much is known about his early years, but he entered the financial world around his 20th birthday. Loewenstein primarily made his fortune selling stock in a Brazilian infrastructure company in Belgium, France, and England to great success. Eventually, Loewenstein became one of the richest men in the world despite being considered eccentric and a quote, loose cannon, in business. In 1908, Loewenstein married Madeleine Misson, a beautiful woman from a prominent Belgian family, and the two had one son together. Their marriage seemed to be one of convenience instead of love. Madeleine enjoyed a life of luxury and Alfred enjoyed having a beautiful wife. The two slept in separate rooms and lived separate lives, with Alfred reportedly spending almost all his time thinking either about his business or his only other passion, horses. On July 4, 1928, in the early evening at Croydon Airport on the outskirts of London, two black limousines approached a brand new idling Fokker FVIIA 3M owned by Loewenstein. The plane was outfit customed for Loewenstein as a flying office. It featured an upholstered chair at the front of the cabin that faced backward, and the plane was equipped with extra soundproofing so Loewenstein could speak to his stenographers over the roar of the three 225-horsepower engines. Between the cockpit and the cabin was a glass partition that allowed for the pilot and mechanic to see what was going on in the back of the plane. At the end of the plane was a small windowless door that led to a washroom with a toilet. Opposite this lavatory was the only door into or out of the airplane, approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide with a small window. When the two black limousines stopped, 7 people emerged for a routine flight to Brussels. There was Alfred Loewenstein, his valet, Fred Baxter, Arthur Hodgson, Loewenstein's secretary and reportedly the person closest to the tycoon, 2 stenographers, Eileen Clark and Paula Biddleon, and the flight crew, pilot Donald Drew and mechanic Robert Little. Before boarding the plane, Loewenstein reportedly stopped at the terminal and made a phone call to Canadian financial Sir Robert Holt, arranging dinner for the following week. A little after 6 p.m. with ideal conditions, the plane took off. A small group of onlookers reported seeing Loewenstein smiling and waving from a window as the plane departed. The plane reached a cruising altitude of 4,000 feet and started heading towards Belgium. According to the accounts of those on board, shortly after crossing the English Channel coastline, Loewenstein sat down a book he was reading and got up. He walked to the back of the plane towards the lavatory, smiling and exchanging some words with Hodgson on the way. After 10 minutes, Loewenstein had not returned. After discussing with Hodgson, Baxter approached the lavatory door and knocked. Hearing no response, he opened the door to reveal nothing. Loewenstein was gone. Hodgson wrote a note explaining the situation and passed it to the pilot. At that point, the nearest airport was about 5 minutes ahead on their current heading at St. Ingelvert, France. Drew, however, instead throttled back and landed on a beach covered in tall sand dunes and unknown to them, under the control of the French military. Shortly after 7:30, passengers, now 6 of them, emerged from the plane and waited for someone to find them. Meanwhile, at Fort Mardyck, Lieutenant Markales of the 1st Battalion dispatched a party to arrest whoever had just landed on his beach. Back at the guard room, the passengers were questioned by Markales and then later by police. The next day, Markales told the Daily Express that while the passengers admitted they'd lost their employer somewhere over the channel, it took a half an hour for them to reveal Loewenstein's name. Both stenographers had been crying. Hodgson was sweating excessively, and Baxter's teeth were chattering. Markales emphasized that he believed their story, saying, "It could not have been play acting. It would have been impossible for those on the aircraft to have acted as they did if M. Loewenstein had not met with some terrible fate." Less than 24 hours after the plane landed on the French beach, all French inquiries were suddenly abandoned. Since the incident had allegedly occurred outside their 3-mile territorial limit, the French argued they didn't have jurisdiction to investigate. British and Belgian officials took the same stance. Any crime, if one even occurred, apparently took place over international waters. And no nation was in a rush to claim it. With no government willing to investigate, there was seemingly only one person on Earth who was motivated to get to the bottom of what had happened to Alfred. His wife, Madeleine. According to Belgian law, Without a body, there could be no death certificate. Without a death certificate, there could be no reading of the will. And without the reading of a will, Loewenstein's estate would be locked up for at least 4 years. Madeleine needed a body, and she let French authorities know a reward would be given to anyone who found it. Meanwhile, newspapers had a full day publishing rumors that turned the story from odd to straight-up bizarre. The Exchange Telegraph reported a French fisherman who saw a parachute descend over the channel the night of Loewenstein's disappearance, as well as a yacht racing out to meet it. The New York Times ran sources claimed that a car had met the plane on the beach and driven Loewenstein off. Another story said Loewenstein was never on the plane, to begin with. And one French newspaper even claimed the eccentric millionaire was having an affair with a female inmate at a local insane asylum, and the two had eloped. Despite no shortage of rumors, a full 2 weeks passed with no sign of Loewenstein. On July 19, in a swell about 10 miles from Cap Gris-Nez, France, skipper Jean-Marie Beaugrand and companion Louis Legris discovered a decomposing body clad in silk underwear, silk socks, shoes, and a watch. They hauled the corpse aboard and read the name engraved on his watch strap, Alfred Loewenstein. The Loewenstein family arranged for a private autopsy. The autopsy took an unusually long time, with the official report released more than 2 months after his death on September 10. The doctor found a large wound in Loewenstein's stomach and that every bone in his body was broken. The report also noted Loewenstein was still alive when he hit the water. The final cause of death was ruled to be a fall of 4,000 feet. With a body found, but practically no official investigation into what happened, it's time for us to jump into theories about what exactly happened to Alfred Loewenstein. Our first theory is the official reported cause that while trying to go to the bathroom, Alfred Loewenstein accidentally opened the wrong door and fell out of the plane. The New York Times reported that in the weeks leading up to the fateful flight, Loewenstein was growing increasingly absent-minded, stating that those around him, quote, had been noticing that he would blunder through wrong doors in his home or offices, while his mind was occupied with grandiose schemes of speculation. At an inquest conducted in Brussels before the body was found, the pilots Drew and the mechanic Little told the judge that as they flew the plane back to England, both men went to the back and were able to easily open the plane's entry and exit door. While neither of the men was under oath at the time, there were no other qualified witnesses to speak on the matter, and the judge had to take them at their word. Outside of Drew and Little, however, most of the aviation world considered this explanation ludicrous. No one had ever been known to have fallen out of such a door. To start, the door to the plane and the door to the washroom looked nothing alike. The airplane door had a window while the bathroom door, for obvious reasons, did not. The weekly magazine, Aeroplane, published the popular opinion that, quote, everyone who knew the machine agreed that the door never opened by accident, end quote. The UK Air Ministry's Chief Inspector Major J.P.C. Cooper examined the door of the plane and found it to be in perfect working order, making an accidental opening even less probable. One Royal Air Force pilot, Officer George Terrell, told the Toronto Daily Mail and Empire why such an explanation would be absurd. Quote, even if a man could get the door open, a super strong man, as soon as the pressure was released, the door would slam shut. Furthermore, as soon as the outside door was opened the slightest bit, everyone inside would be aware of it. A blast of wind would blow through the cabin. While Loewenstein was generally considered to be physically strong, he had been sick with rheumatism in the days leading up to the flight, physically weakening the tycoon. However, even if Loewenstein had been in tip-top shape, it's hard to imagine him accidentally opening the door. Norman W. Ray, a reporter from The Evening Standard, conducted some experiments on a similar aircraft, and while in flight, couldn't get the door to budge. Ray even used a brace to thrust against the door with all his weight and still only managed to crack the door open about 3 inches. Our second theory is that Alfred Loewenstein killed himself by leaping from the plane. While not everyone who dies of suicide has an obvious outward reason for killing themselves, some point out that Loewenstein was in a bit of financial trouble at the time of his death, owing money to various people. It does seem a bit odd, however, that Loewenstein would have stopped by the airport terminal before the flight to make dinner plans for the next week if he was planning on killing himself that day. Further, after the plane landed on that French beach, mechanic Robert Little picked up a set of notes Loewenstein was reportedly writing on the plane before his death. The notes were about monies owed and upcoming business dealings, action plans for the future, and far from what anyone would consider a suicide note. Of course, this theory also suffers from the same flaws as the accident theory. Specifically, the fact that most agree, it would be physically impossible for Loewenstein to open the door himself. With accident and suicide, both physically unlikely, it's time we look at the third theory that Alfred Loewenstein was murdered. Many point out that while it appears impossible for one man to have opened the door mid-flight, it was shown that two men working together could manage it. There was also no shortage of peculiar behavior on behalf of the other passengers that could indicate underhanded dealings. For instance, why did the plane land on the beach instead of at the nearby airport? One of Loewenstein's obituaries mentioned that he never read books. So why did the passengers insist he had been reading before getting up? Was he reading or making notes about his business dealings? Finally, as Loewenstein was known to never drink, why did the coroner find alcohol in his system? Contributing to this theory is the story mechanic Robert Little told his wife Julie Little before his death. According to Julie, Robert said that he had been at the controls at the time of the disappearance. Before Loewenstein got up, Robert saw Loewenstein remove his jacket, collar, and tie, stand up and seemingly gasp for air. Robert told his wife he suspected Loewenstein had been poisoned. If Loewenstein was murdered, there's also the question of who was behind it. So let's get into the suspects. Our prime suspects are obviously the people on the plane, specifically, the pilot Drew and mechanic Little. Their behavior was the most suspicious of the group. While Little said that he was flying when Loewenstein first got out of his chair, he reportedly passed the controls over to Drew. When it became clear, Loewenstein was missing. Drew was therefore who landed the plane on the beach instead of at an airport. It's also unclear why neither Little nor Drew didn't use the radio to notify anyone that a passenger had seemingly fallen from the plane. Drew also gave contradicting stories about whether he had turned the plane around to search for Loewenstein before landing. For Little's part, while he discovered the notes Loewenstein had been making on the plane, he never handed them over to authorities. Some speculate this was because the notes would rule out suicide, an option he wanted authorities to keep as plausible to steer attention away from the theory of murder. There's also their testimony, given to the Belgian judge stating they were able to open the door while flying back to England, an assertion most people claim must have been a lie. If Drew and Little or anyone else on board for that matter was responsible for shoving Loewenstein off his plane, the rest of the passengers would have all had to agree to keep their mouths shut or have been in on it. If that's the case, William Norris, author of a book about this case, The Man Who Fell from the Sky, argues someone likely paid everyone off. Our first suspect is Madeleine Loewenstein. Though Madeleine would benefit financially from her husband's death, their relationship appeared to be, by all accounts, amiable. Madeleine was freely reaping the benefits of her husband's wealth while he was alive with seemingly no demands placed upon her. The other group of suspects who would want Loewenstein dead are various business competitors and associates. Loewenstein's financial ties were complex and vast, and there's no shortage of people who would have had an interest in seeing Loewenstein dead. Perhaps the most suspicious are Major Albert Pam and Mr. Frederick Zarvasi. These two men, along with Loewenstein, were the three major stockholders of a company called International Holdings. Without Loewenstein in the picture, Pam and Zarvasi would see serious financial gain. While the stock crashed after Loewenstein went missing, if someone had advanced knowledge of his demise, they could have stood to seriously profit. Indeed, after Loewenstein's death, author Norris found that Pam and Zarvasi announced a profit from, quote, transactions of a special nature, of over $13 million. The current day equivalent of $200 million. As Lieutenant Marcales of the French 1st Battalion watched that Fokker FVIIA, 3 meters, touch down on the sandy beach almost 100 years ago, he couldn't have known the mystery that was waiting on board. One of the richest men in the world, either by accident, suicide, or murder, was dead. and 6 suspiciously acting employees were the only ones who could shed any light on what had happened. With all of the passengers now dead, it appears that however Alfred Loewenstein ended up plummeting to his death over the English Channel will remain unsolved.